And then we've got a little bit, kind of a preview.
This is a preview story. You may have caught this already, but this is really a compilation of just some of the stories we have ready to go for you tomorrow.
Where you really, truly have a massive humanitarian situation where you're trying to take care of people who don't have heat, they don't have water, they don't have food, the things that they need to just basically sustain life. That's what really, really, truly gives me nightmares and keeps me up at night.
Whether it's June or February, the ability for government to respond will simply be overwhelmed. Over 1.25 million people will need food and water, the same for more than 750,000 pets. Nearly 500,000 people will need emergency shelter.
But instead of a grocery list, we have this. The Emergency Management Division's suggested list of supplies to be 2 weeks ready in the event of a disaster. Let's start with water. You'll need 1 gallon per person per day. That's 14 gallons for just you. And for a family of 4, it's 56 gallons.
Yeah, we built this ourselves.
In the basement of an old schoolhouse, Doug Nelson, a 5th-generation Fox Island resident, shows us what some consider one of the most well-laid-out plans in Pierce County.
Post-disaster, the first thing we're going to do is send out our citizen patrol members. Each one will take a different route.
They've built an emergency operations center with a network of people using ham radios.
Yeah, I've got a battery backup radio at my place. All these people are radio operators.
All of this gets packed in plastic bins and stored under the bed or in closets. Fallon, who lives in the Enso building in South Lake Union, is an exception in this increasingly vertical city.
Because you never know what situation you're going to get into.
She's taken the time and invested the money to prepare for a disaster.
What we realized is that we really need to do it on our own.
The following risks are the top 3.
We're looking at the Cascadia subduction zone, the ground shaking. You can see it goes all the way across the state. There will be low shaking in Spokane, and then a tsunami that follows. Seattle fault zone, located in the Seattle basin, multiple faults, intense shaking around the fault radiating outwards.
South Whidbey.
This is the southern Whidbey Island fault in between Everett and Seattle. Intense shaking around the fault radiating outward.
It's not if, it's when.
So again, the biggest change we've seen here in the last year is going from a recommendation of being on your own for 3 days up to 14 days. With me now is my old friend Bill Steele with Pacific Northwest Seismic Network. You're the guys that monitor earthquakes around. You're there on campus at the University of Washington, but you're really kind of your own thing. What is it that you can tell us when something happens?
Well, we actually manage a network of hundreds of seismometers from the California border up to Canada, and then we also import from California and Canada and to the east instruments and data so that we can better constrain earthquakes on our borders. So we monitor, we watch earthquakes, we look at the hazards, and we follow the research on these hazards, these various faults the earthquakes occur on face. Yeah.
I guess one of the questions that I have, because we're always doing stories with you guys about a lot of the latest science that comes in, and we're also building out the network. The last big project we worked with you was earthquake early warning.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about that. What will that do that will help us now that will soon be able to help us that we couldn't do before?
Well, earthquake early warning is the capability of detecting an earthquake very rapidly as it occurs, and then being able to broadcast an alert at the speed of light that radio waves travel at to populations that the shaking hasn't arrived to yet. So if you're right above an earthquake, if it's shallow, you don't get much warning, but very soon we can constrain the earthquake, send out an alert, and you can get 10, 20, 30 seconds warning for a crustal earthquake and as much as 4 or 5 minutes for a Cascadia event. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of time depending on what you're doing. We're talking about stopping surgery, slowing down trains,
protecting water systems, that was part of our story. That's one of the pilot programs with RH2 Engineering here in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, broadcasting, airports. This is being worked up and down the West Coast from LA north, basically.
That's right, and we're learning from the users, from the pilot testers and industry and agencies, you know, what these uses are. How are they going to deploy earthquake early warning to reduce losses? And we're learning a lot every year. So we're just starting to run live pilots where people are actually taking actions using these alerts, and that's going to teach us a lot and get ready for a public system to roll out in a year or two.
But that's one piece of it. The preparation, if it's like you know you're going to get hit with an earthquake of such a magnitude in 45 seconds, that's too late to go to the store and said I need extra water and a few flashlight batteries.
Earthquake early warning will not strengthen your building, and it's not going to get grandma's prescription from the drugstore, you know, that you're going to need after that earthquake. So it doesn't take the place of preparedness. It doesn't take the place of mitigation. It's one more tool in our box to be able to initiate actions automatically when we get these alerts that can improve the resilience of an organization or a utility, or have airplanes fly about instead of trying to land while the shaking occurs. So it's kind of that last minute mitigation that can occur with earthquake early warning.
But the fact is the science continues to advance.
Yes.
There's a lot we still don't know.
It's true.
A lot we do know. And I think one of the concerns that I have, having covered this issue since I moved out here more than 30 years ago, was that people say, well, I've heard of this before, so why it hasn't happened, why do I have to do anything? The fact is it has happened. We had the Nisqually earthquake in 2001, but my concern is, say, well, people, that did not create the kind of mass destruction that we're expecting out of a Cascadia event, out of a Seattle event, Seattle fault event, out of a South Whidbey event. Then there's the Tacoma fault. There's a lot more beyond those three.
Oh, yeah. And many more we haven't discovered yet. So again, that
more
gap of knowledge that we still have and we're still learning. So humans are very bad at these long-term problems. You know, if you have something that reoccurs every 1,000 years, every 500 years, every 300 years, it's very hard to get someone to set aside their day-to-day problems to deal with those in a realistic way. And so we're just wired badly for it. So it takes a little extra effort for us to take the broad picture. And luckily, or sadly, we do have big earthquakes occurring all over the world that we can learn from. We can learn from what failed, what worked, preparations that worked, preparations that were inadequate, and we can build on that. So when our big earthquake occurs in the not too distant future, likely, we'll be ready to manage it better.
Well, I want to come back to that for a minute, but the Tohoku earthquake, which is the Japanese earthquake in 2011, March of 2011, killed 16,000 people, mostly because of the tsunami. The last time that had gone off was 800 years ago.
Yeah.
Yet here it was going off in our lifetime.
And the Japanese, some of the greatest scientists and seismologists in the world, really felt they would see nothing larger than a magnitude 7.9, magnitude 8 in the Japan Trench. And when they had a magnitude 9, all of their models, all of their predictions kind of just went up in smoke.
Well, you can see that because they had not built the tsunami walls, which are common in Japan. They don't exist here. We're not high enough, and where you're seeing large fishing vessels being pushed over those tsunami walls.
Yeah, those pictures are just etched in our brains at this point. It was a kind of a horrifying sight to watch and see people actually having to struggle with a tsunami when they're in the midst of it. But and it's going to be horrible here. So we really need to get our coastal communities prepared, and we need to give them some aid so they have some evacuation options when that earthquake and tsunami does strike. There are many areas along our coast where there are no good evacuation options.
Right. And that's where the 2 weeks comes into. And you can see we now have, this is from the Washington Department of Natural Resources, also now known as the Washington Geological Survey. This is the shake map for the Cascadia subduction zone. You can see the fault, which is, we're talking plate tectonics here. It's a fault, but it's sort of really where two plates join. You can just see the severity of the shaking on the coast. And then from the red to the orange to the lighter orange, people in Spokane will feel this.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
We're not going to see necessarily damage in Japan, in Spokane.
Right, right. No, likely not. The other side of the Cascades are likely to be there to provide aid, although there are likely to be landslides in the coastal range in particular, but also in the Cascades that can make it difficult to move goods and services across to aid the West. And that's one of the concerns too. When you affect the whole region from northern British Columbia all the way down to Cape Mendocino, California, where is the aid going to come from?
So if somebody assumes, well, the folks in Portland or Vancouver, BC will be here to help us.
No. They're going to be completely wrapped up in their own problems, and our transportation infrastructure will be disrupted. Not everywhere, but in enough places where we'll kind of have transportation islands, if you will. Between here and here, you can move around, but you can't get to the next leg. And it's going to take quite a bit of time to repair those bridges or the causeways or the failed components to be able to have the connectivity again that we've come to expect.
So I want to go to some of your questions here. We've got several that are sort of queued up. I mean, this is something we can talk about forever just like this. Zachary asks, and I've got one right here, what type of radio should I use in an emergency? This is mine. It actually lives on my desk. It has a wind-up.
Yeah, you got your crank
feature. It has all sorts of things, but it also has a Noaa weather radio. Actually, I got it to blink.
Yeah, so Noaa weather radio has been very helpful, not only to give you weather warnings and where dangerous storms are coming in and winds, etc., but they also broadcast information about earthquakes, and in an event such as a Cascadia earthquake or a big earthquake locally, you'll be able to get some information from them. This radio will also work on the FM and AM band, and a number of your favorite AM and FM news-related stations will also be on the air broadcasting throughout the event.
Well, the thing about it is you can set it and forget it. You can just leave it and the alert will go off.
Right.
In the Midwest, you can get these things that sort of sit there like turtles on the desk.
Right.
And they're just plugged in. And then if you've been back there and if you heard there's a tornado warning, you'll hear a set of tones and it'll come out and say, like Kane County, Cook County, the Chicago area where I grew up are under a tornado watch or a tornado warning. Sometimes it comes off at 3:30 in the morning, but if that's when you need to seek shelter, there's no scheduled time.
Well, and Noaa is also responsible for issuing tsunami warnings, and we're working with Noaa, and the USGS is working with Noaa, and they may be part of sort of the eventual public alerting for earthquake early warnings as well. So that's a good bet to keep a Noaa weather radio on hand.
We've touched on it earlier. I want to go back to it to answer her. Sarah Jane says, what are the tsunami risks with a major earthquake?
Well, it depends on the earthquake.
Right.
So a major earthquake on the Seattle fault, there would be a local tsunami danger in the Puget Sound that would affect Commencement Bay. Could put, if we repeated the 1100-year-old event in AD 900 that happened on the Seattle fault that raised that beach on Bainbridge Island you talked about, well, that could put a 7-meter tsunami in Elliott Bay and affect our low-lying coastal areas.
So here around Soto, Harbor Island.
That's right.
We'll show you a graphic of this tomorrow. Again, that would be on the Seattle fault. You can see, here's the LiDAR image. That you can see what Bainbridge Island looks like on the right with all the trees. You strip away the trees. That line across the northern portion of the picture there, that is the Seattle fault on the surface.
It's a thrust of it anyway, yeah.
So why does it matter if it's on the surface?
Well, what matters is the closer you are to the rupture, the more violent the shaking is. The high frequency energy, the really high accelerations attenuate fairly rapidly as you move away from the source of the earthquake. So a crustal earthquake can shake us well in excess of 1 G in vertical and horizontal acceleration. That's the force of gravity. Knock you off your feet. There's no way you can remain standing with that kind of shaking. So compared to the Nisqually earthquake, which felt to most people in Seattle as kind of a rolling, dangerous, maybe nerve-wracking, but manageable sort of shaking level if you were below 10% G. So a huge difference.
So we're going to leap ahead here again. Pierce County Department of Emergency Management throws in a question, how will the tsunami for the big one, being on the coast, we showed you that graphic earlier, impact Puget Sound, and could it go all the way to the Nisqually Delta?
It will. So, but it'll take time. So one, we'll have a lot of warning, we'll have a lot of time to prepare, but the wave that comes into the Puget Sound through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, it's a pretty narrow window to get into the Sound. So it's going to limit the size of the tsunami here, and then it spreads out through the Sound. So we could get up to, in a worst case scenario where you have a big uplift right off of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, perhaps 2 meters, meter to 2 meters in Seattle, and maybe about the same in Commencement Bay, maybe a little less. So not a huge wave, and certainly fits within the normal tide variations, but if it's high tide, you could get some flooding from that.
But that's Puget Sound. If you look at areas around Bellingham, the San Juan Islands, and certainly in Canada.
Well, and here's the other big problem here. We talk about run-up for a tsunami or a wave height. That's one issue. Right. But we're also going to have very dramatic currents running through the Sound, and levels of the water dropping, maybe putting boats in a marina on the sand, and then a wave comes in and floods them. But you're also going to have very strong currents, up to 60 knots between some of the islands in the San Juans and around Whidbey Island and different places where you have, currents going through narrow passages, and that's going to really
because you're forcing a lot of water through a funnel.
So you don't want to be out in a boat, ideally, and it's going to really wreck a lot of marinas and cause a lot of havoc.
I want to double back to, because people go, what about volcanoes? Will this set off a volcanic eruption?
That's unlikely. It has happened that big earthquakes have triggered volcanic activity, but it's volcanoes that have been kind of getting ready to erupt for a long time anyway, and it's kind of the straw, that shaking is the straw that breaks the camel's back.
But the two are not exclusive from each other. The system that's giving us the earthquakes, even the system that gave us the Nisqually earthquake at a 6.8 in 2001, in 65 and 49 and 47, as well as Mount St. Helens, they're all kind of part of the same ring of fire.
That's right. It's part of that same tectonic interaction of the Juan de Fuca plate subducting beneath North America, and it's a conveyor belt. It's bringing water-rich kind of ocean basalts and rocks down to a zone where there's so much heat and pressure they can't remain in the rock anymore, the volatiles, the water, and so the minerals change. There's a process called fluxing that generates magma, and that feeds these volcanoes, but that's over long periods of time, right? So you can't connect easily this earthquake with this batch of magma rising in the volcano. It takes this kind of a longer term thing. If you speed up the clock, geologic time, it would look like it's all one sort of system, just feeding magma up into the volcanoes. But in our time spans, it's quite disconnected.
But not unrelated.
Not unrelated, not at all.
Let me keep going. Bonnie asks, I've read everything west of I-5 will be gone. Is that true?
No, it's not true at all. And actually what the FEMA director said was that we're doing our exercises as if everything west of I-5 will be gone, which maybe wasn't the best way to phrase things, but it's kind of the way they were trying to plan for this exercise coming up. In reality, most places west of I-5 in the Puget Sound area, neighborhoods will look pretty much the way they do now. There'll be toppled chimneys, there'll be some pockets where you're going to have more concentrated damage. Certainly the unreinforced masonry buildings you mentioned are going to be under extreme jeopardy. We're going to see highway collapses and bridges fail, but they're going to be scattered.
Well, we're going to talk about some of those numbers tomorrow. I will be live starting at King 5 News in the morning at about 5 a.m. We will be at the Emergency Operations Center for the state that was the center of this giant exercise. We'll be talking to both the National Guard and to Robert Ezell, who you saw in our piece earlier, who is the Director of Emergency Management for the state of Washington. But you saw again that graphic, I don't know if we can get it back up again, which is the relative shaking from that sort of deep red at the coast to lighter and lighter shades.
So what I'd like to say is that everyone west of I-5 is going to have to struggle, it's not going to be business as usual after this earthquake. So they're going to need to be able to get food, they're going to need to have water, they're going to need to have supplies, they're going to need to have medications, because there's going to be enough disruption of the transportation system and delivery system, and with our just-in-time inventories, they're not going to get what they need from the stores for quite a while.
Which is what's driving the 2 weeks is sort of, in some places, is not going to be enough. That's sort of the general guideline.
That's right.
So Norma says, what happens to southwest Washington coast?
Very similar. Southwest Washington coast is going to be clobbered with strong shaking and a tsunami that's going to follow that. So you want to move to high ground immediately upon feeling the shaking from a duration. We say the earthquake is the warning, right? That's your warning if you're on the coast,
tsunami, right?
Particularly if it lasts more than 30 seconds. You know it's a very big earthquake, and you want to move to high ground. So that should be the warning. Unfortunately, there are areas that's very challenging to get to high ground, and for some of the tsunami scenarios that are being looked at, very large areas are inundated that have populations that can't escape.
Well, the Long Beach Peninsula is a particular concern because it is so long. You know, if you're toward the end of that, if you're out there, it's a long drive to get out.
Now, that doesn't mean when you have a big earthquake necessarily that whole island, that whole peninsula is going to be inundated, but it could be. And so we really want to see some vertical evacuation options where people can get to higher ground and ride out those tsunami waves and begin the recovery.
I was just down in Pacific County. They're doing much more public outreach there. The Sheriff's Department, the Sheriff's been a great guy down here on this issue. Yeah. They have been bringing people in. It's a lot of folks who are looking at it. City of Long Beach is looking at doing a vertical evacuation structure. Yep. We do have one on the coast now. That's the Acosta School, which is, if you don't know where that is Westport. And they have built a new school with a gymnasium, and it's over the gymnasium, the cafeteria. It's a very strong earthquake-resistant structure, concrete, heavily reinforced. In the entire community, there's basically 4 corners we can go up. This is actually a map of the school district vulnerability in terms of seismic safety from Washington Department of Natural Resources. I think this is a little dated because Acosta is one of the districts in red that would back off, I think, a little more. But a lot of concern goes to a lot of the older schools in particular that would be vulnerable in their estimation. This is a by district map. We're also seeing some concerns by actual individual schools, which we're also including into our coverage here. But one of the assumptions we need to make here is that the schools need to be able to take care of the kids. If this happens during the day, you may not be able to get to them. Because bridges, even if the bridge isn't down, it has to be inspected before traffic's allowed.
Well, first we want schools that are not going to collapse on the kids, and secondly we want schools that can support the kids safely until parents can pick them up. And then the other thing, the schools are critical for the recovery. We can't really begin recovering until the kids have a safe place to go and get educated. So they're important in a lot of reasons, and areas like Aberdeen, other cities along the coast that don't have a tremendous amount of resources and have a lot of vulnerable buildings that will be damaged or even collapse perhaps in one of these earthquakes, we really need to have a statewide effort, and perhaps with some federal help, to strengthen those schools or get kids in safer buildings.
I want to go back to our questions. Kelly asks, which really is the one thing on everybody's mind. We've kind of addressed it a little earlier, but I really want to do a much deeper dive here. When will this happen? And the thing about it is it's not just one this.
No, we don't know when the earthquake's going to happen. And we can give probabilities. We have a pretty good idea of how frequently we have a big crustal earthquake in the Puget Sound, like the Seattle Fault, South Whidbey Island Fault, Darrington Devil's Mountain, Tacoma Fault, and others we're discovering. We know very clearly how frequently the Cascadia subduction zone ruptures, and we're in a window where it could happen tomorrow, but it might not happen for another 100 years or so. We don't know. And then we have our deep mom and apple pie earthquakes like Nisqually and the 1965 deep earthquake and the 1949 magnitude 7.1 under Olympia. These earthquakes occur every 20 to 30 years on average, historically, and are probably going to be our next challenge.
But I want to go to that point about Nisqually. Nisqually created $4 billion worth of damage. It did not kill anybody directly. There are stories about somebody who died of a heart attack from it, but it wasn't anything fell on them. And people said, wow, okay, I rode that one out, I'm good. My house rode that one out, I'm good. Everyththing's fine.
Right.
That was the test.
Well, there were deaths in 49 and 65,
Correct.
and we were very lucky, just very lucky with the Nisqually earthquake. Had it been a little bit larger, a little larger magnitude, a little longer duration, we would have seen many more failures and likely people dying. You see the piles of bricks on the sidewalks in Olympia and in Pioneer Square area. We were just lucky nobody was under those when they fell. We won't be so lucky perhaps next time. But the other point is that it really has a huge impact on the economy too over time. If you close whole neighborhoods and sections of the city from people being able to move in and out because you have collapsed unreinforced masonry buildings blocking streets, perhaps blocking fire trucks, blocking egress to the hospital, etc., it has a kind of a far-reaching effect on your ability to recover.
But you also do, it's sort of like a weather forecast. You do a probability, it's like a probability of rain.
That's
so
right.
you can't say next Tuesday at 3 o'clock there's going to be a 7.1 on the Benioff zone, which is where the Nisqually quake happened. But what you can say is over the next 50 years there's an X percentage chance of a particular style of earthquake.
That's right, and for a big, deep earthquake, it's like an 83% chance in the next 50 years. That's about as solid to a sure thing as you can get.
That would be like Nisqually.
Like Nisqually, right. Somewhere greater than 6.5 in the Puget Sound area, somewhere in the region, another one of those earthquakes.
Let me go back to our questions. You mentioned prescriptions several times. Bobby Joe asked, how many days or weeks of prescription medication should we have on hand? I think you kind of saw it, at least 2 weeks. Probably more would be a good idea, particularly if it's critical.
I think if you're really dependent on a medication for your for your life, for your health, that try to get a month in advance supply of that medication and keep it in safe conditions.
But I think this goes to us Cascadia. And it's one thing if you're talking about allergy medication, obviously you're talking about hay fever versus something that would be critical for somebody.
Right.
But one of the things that you're going to hear some discussion about tomorrow, and we're going to get into this with the National Guard, emergency management, and I think this is a great question, is standing things back up. It's not like at the end of 2 weeks.
Everything's good.
Everything's good.
Right.
Your pharmacy is back in business. One of the great concerns there is the loss of hospitals, the ability of doctors and nurses to get to the hospitals, the ability of specialists to, because when you, as we've seen particularly in parts of the world that don't have particularly good building codes or a lot of masonry structures, talk about unreinforced masonry, we have horrible injuries. People have limbs that are crushed, things like that. I mean, it's pretty bad. That can happen here. So,
and the hospitals are vulnerable. They have wings that are older and not matched. So you may have maybe only 30% of your hospital in operation, maybe 50%, but it's going to be impacted.
Right. They're talking about half of Western Washington's hospital capacity could be lost in a Cascadia style earthquake.
Yeah, so that's a great point, Glenn, and that's why I'm saying that for medication and things like that, eventually things will fly in. We'll get an open airport, some supplies will fly in, but then how are they going to be distributed? Probably to hospitals, probably then to some other, the public health network will begin to reach out, but how long is it going to take to get to your medicine cabinet? I wouldn't count on having that done in 2 weeks for a really big earthquake, and that's why I think it's wise to have that extra supply on hand.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah asks, what extra steps can we take care to prepare ourselves, not only protect ourselves, but also help others who are unprepared? And that's frankly one of the big discussions here in working with Barb Graff. She's the long-term director of Seattle Emergency Management. She was in Bellevue before. For many years, and she said, my takeaway was only about 50, they did a survey not too many years ago and found only about half the people in the survey kind of really knew about the risks, but only about 1 in 4 had taken any action to get ready for it.
Yeah, it is a real problem, and But I think one of the things that we want to do is not just doom and gloom. You have to have this big kit ready for a big earthquake. But I think starting to, in the sense of looking at all of the hazards and risks we face and getting to know your neighbors, getting to know the resources in your neighborhood. You know, who's the nurse down the street? Where is there somebody who may need to be checked in on? Maybe they're older and they're living alone and they need someone to check in. Get to know your neighbors is a really important step to being prepared.
But that goes back to the neighborhood idea, and back in the 90s, you were working on a lot of these neighborhood initiatives to try and get people to do just what you were describing.
That's right, and Seattle has a program now, and so do other communities. They may call them slightly different things, they may have slightly different ways of kind of getting the neighborhoods together and finding those resources. But I know in my neighborhood, we're beginning to now share some resources. We know where a generator is available. We know where certain capabilities are available as far as nurses and veterinaries and other kinds of things. And we have a kind of loose plan. We could do a lot better, but we've at least initiated that step.
So just so you know, we have a lot of material already on our website, king5.com/disaster. We've laid a lot of that out there. You can go there and you can read a lot of that now. You can find links to the various emergency management agencies, reports, studies, the geology, some of the stuff we've already been writing up. We'll put a lot of those stories on TV and online tomorrow, so you'll always be able to see them. Let me go back to questions. Linda's asking, so where are the higher ground areas we need to go to? A lot of that is, there are a lot of signs out at the coast. She's talking about the tsunami.
Right.
Not so much here in Puget Sound, but at least at the coast that exists. But part of the concern is people just thinking they can just jump in their cars and drive.
Right. No, you've got to assume the roads are gone. And some of the more pessimistic views of how many people will get out are kind of based on conservative estimates of how people walk, and how many seniors are in the community and how quickly are they going to walk. And I think in some cases we might do a little bit better. I think good signage has been really helpful, and we find that the people on the coast are aware there's a tsunami hazard, are aware of which direction they have to head and where the safe ground is. And I think that's going to be a big help too, because they're going to know which way to go and begin that evacuation.
Well, even a number of the tribes on the coast who also have a big summer business, with people coming from wherever to go fishing, see the sights, enjoy the scenery. They actually have put in the hotel room help for people.
Right.
If you're out of town, saying this happens, this is what you do.
Yeah, Washington Emergency Management has developed booklets for hotels and motels to have available in tsunami hazard zones to help inform guests of what's going on, and also train some of the people at the desk and the people in the tourist industry, so that they understand how to get their folks to safety.
Well, the good news in some of these areas, like around La Push, is you can get to high ground fairly quickly.
Right.
If you're at the end of the Long Beach Peninsula or in Westport, that's more challenging. That's why Westport built the Acosta School. But there are inundation maps that are available online from Noaa.
And Washington DNR. They've done a phenomenal job of taking a look at different size tsunamis and drawing those lines on maps, and you can clearly see where those hazard zones are.
Where the higher ground is. Telephone question, will landlines be more reliable than cell phones?
At one time we said yes, that's the thing, but now a lot of that's voice over IP too. It's moving that way. I still think that you may have a little better luck getting an out of state. It's ideal to have both, I guess, that you have redundancy there if you have a copper landline, because the power source is different, and you're not depending on the same cell tower, which we know gets congested pretty rapidly after a big earthquake.
But among the recommendations, texting works better. That's more likely to get out in a cell phone versus a call. The lines will be jammed. One of the other things is have somebody out of state.
Yeah.
So if you've got a grandma in Cleveland, somebody who can, so if you and your kids or depending what your family structure is, your friends know, everybody calls Grandma in Cleveland.
Right.
So she knows that you're okay, and then she can relay that. You may not be able to, I may not be able to call you, but we may actually have better luck getting hold of Grandma in Cleveland.
That's right, because at least you're going out of the area, so you're not, the receiving end doesn't have to worry about their connectivity too, and it's a lot easier to get out of the area on a landline. But cell phones have been coming back quicker too, and I think cell phone companies are gearing up to try to deploy emergency measures. I'm a little more concerned down the road if we lose power. How long will the generators run? How long will the cell towers stay up? I think we're good for a while, but they will tend to start
I know a friend of
failing.
mine used to install those systems, and a lot of the cell towers have battery backups,
They
some
do.
even generators, things like
Yep.
that. But when the battery dies and the fuel runs out,
then you have a challenge.
Right. The Kylie asked, how long after an earthquake does a tsunami strike? I think this is critical.
Again, it depends on where you are, but you can count on about 20 minutes on the coast of Washington. And that first wave may be a negative wave, so it could even be longer. So there is a period of time enough that you protect yourself during the shaking and then immediately evacuate to higher ground. You can have that 15, 20 minutes of surety that you can move quite a ways.
But in the Indian Ocean tsunami, one of the things that they found, that was the first big tsunami in a very, very long time. And people in like Puget in Thailand said, oh, the ocean went away. Let's go out and find stuff on this newly exposed beach. Big mistake.
That was particularly challenging because the rupture was far enough offshore that they didn't feel the shaking. And so you only saw the results of the tsunami. The negative wave came first, pulled the water out, and people go, oh, that's interesting, and go out to explore, and then they're in terrible shape when the positive wave comes in. So
which is even bigger.
Which is big, tends to be bigger, yes.
And it's not just one wave. We all have this sort of popular culture thing of this giant curling wave, and it's really tall, but that's it. But that's not the case.
No, it's not like a wind-driven wave or a breaker as we think of it on the shore. It's more of a surge of water and the wavelength is very long. Out at sea, it's about 200 kilometers long. It shortens up as it comes near the coast and it shallows, and that's when you get the amplitude of the wave building and it shortens, but it's still a very long wave. It goes for minutes and minutes and minutes of rising water, as you could see from the Tohoku earthquake, where the boat started moving and then it just kept rising and rising and rising and rising, and then overtook the seawalls.
But then you have have multiple waves.
And
just because one goes by, that doesn't mean everything.
And the third wave may be the largest. You don't know. So the first wave is not necessarily the largest.
So our last subduction zone Cascadia earthquake was January 26th, the year 1700, 9 p.m.
Yeah, very good.
The story behind that is fascinating. How do we know that?
We know that we know it from a series of research efforts, one of which was Brian Atwater and David Yamaguchi of the USGS. David, I think, was with the University of Washington at the time. Started doing dendrochronology, looking at, they recognized that trees growing along the coast drop down with the soil as this big earthquake occurs. The North America thrusts to the west and drops anywhere from 0.5 meter to 2.5 meters. That will flood the low-lying areas and kill the trees with salt water. If they could look at the tree rings and find when they died, these ghost forests along our coast, they could count backwards and see exactly how long ago the earthquake occurred. And I'll make a long story short. They discovered that the earthquake occurred between the growing season of 1699 and before the growing season of 1700. So somewhere between September and when tree sap would start moving up in the trees in the spring again. So they narrowed it down to a season. And then from there, started looking at all the little villages up and down the coast of Japan at their ancient records, their records from 1700 that the samurai lords had to keep to tell the shogun how much rice rations they distributed, was there damage to the fields, was there disaster or problems and loss of life. And they found this story of an orphan tsunami that came with no shaking associated with it and flooded numerous villages up and down the Japanese coast.
So by the time that tsunami that originated from our own coast
Cascadia
reached Japan,
right,
it really hit Japan.
Yes, it
hard.
did. Yeah, lives were lost, villages were flooded, or low-lying areas in villages. And based on the wave amplitudes or the heights, what got flooded in Japan, when the wave arrived, what got flooded, we were able to go back and say this had to be close to a magnitude 9 earthquake, or maybe a little above or a little below. And we got the hour that the earthquake occurred.
Because the tsunami energy wave always travels at the same rate.
Well, it varies depending on the depth of the ocean and some other things, but we've been able to, Noaa has modeled that quite well.
But it's basically the speed of a jetliner.
About 550 kilometers or so an hour, or 500 kilometers an hour. So, you know, it's like a 12-hour, 13-hour trip to Japan.
Okay, let me click off a few quick questions here. Haley asks, how will our mountain passes be affected?
That's a great question, Haley. And you know, in the winter, if we have a whole lot of snow up there, that shaking is likely to bring down a lot of avalanches and bring down a lot of snow and ice. It could trigger landslides at other times. It's going to shake, and areas that are weak and prone for rock falls and stuff are likely to have them. And so I think we need to expect that there's going to be some disruption of highway traffic until DOT can get out and clear those ways. It's going to be worse in the coastal range because, again, you mentioned the stronger shaking the closer you get to the coast. So it's going to be very hard to get material and supplies to coastal communities because they're going to be disrupted moving north-south, and there's likely to be landslides and closed roads in the coastal range.
There's a good question that's coming up. I'm not sure who asked this. Has the area seen increased seismic action lately? And I think this is a great question because there seems to be, well, if there's been a lot of small seismic activity, that must mean something bigger is in the wings.
And in the long sense, that there's something to that. I mean, in general, every 10 magnitude 2s you see, you'll get a magnitude 3. And every 10 magnitude 3s, you'll see a magnitude 4. And this isn't hard and fast. And different areas, different depths of the Earth, you get somewhat different ratios. But in general, that sort of holds true with earthquakes. And so, yeah, the more little earthquakes you have, the more likely you are to have a larger earthquake. I think, though, that we're not seeing increased seismicity here in the Pacific Northwest as much as we are improving our ability to detect earthquakes by improving our networks and communicating that. So a lot of and also there are periods where you are having more earthquakes and periods that are somewhat quieter, and we tend to forget that. And when we're in a period where there's more earthquake activity, we try to say, whoa, this is surprising. But if you really kind of look, there's sort of a normal fluctuation that occurs, and we're well within the normal.
But one of the things that was just discovered a few decades ago, back in the late 90s, I want to say, and that exists both in Japan and here, are these deep tremor quakes that happen on a schedule.
That's right.
They are significant magnitudes. They're very deep.
In totality, they're significant magnitudes.
Totalitarian, but it takes take weeks to play out.
Right.
And they have
thousands of individual little events make up tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands.
Nobody notices.
We notice.
But you do. But you got extra great listening devices there. The bottom line here is we keep, scientifically, you guys keep mining those types of quakes, looking for what they can tell us about the shaking quakes that will cause damage and loss of life.
And to better understand the whole mechanics of how these subduction zones work, right? I mean, and what's happening to the rocks as they descend and the water is coming off of them, and what does that do to the rocks above them in the North America crust? And we've learned a tremendous amount in the last couple of decades studying this, and we've come to see that we think now that the earthquake is likely to rupture further down dip than we expected. and that will bring
meaning further toward the mantle, toward the hot parts.
Yeah, toward the hot, further down dip, but that also brings the shaking closer to the Puget Sound area and closer to Seattle and Tacoma and where our populations live. So it means that we're likely to have stronger shaking here in the urban areas than we previously expected, based on where these deep tremor, little tiny earthquakes end under the Olympic Peninsula.
Gracie asked a great question. I'm going to answer this way. She says, how are we supposed to store 14 days of supplies in a small city living spaces? That actually is Ted Land's story tomorrow. You saw a piece of that there. I think that's a factor.
That's a great question, and I think we need to be creative in thinking. Certainly there are ways of storing some water, and I think there are also ways of keeping filtration systems and other ways that you can get suspect water that may be somewhat contaminated or polluted or from a body of water like Lake Union or Lake Washington, and make it pure for your drinking. And I think if you're in a very small spot and can't keep that many bottles or jugs of water, you can keep some of the water in liquid form, and then have some means of collecting or producing potable water from other sources.
Now Braxton asks, I'll take this question, does King 5 know something we don't? Why are we talking about this so much right now? Well, the reason is, as I've explained, we did this back in the 90s. We had a big plan. So 22 years ago, we dusted that off, and again, circumstances have changed. But what I've noticed is, having covered this again for 3 decades, among some of the other things that I do, is that things tend to reach kind of a plateau. There tends to be a lot of interest. People are going to get, oh God, if Farley mentions the Cascadia subduction zone one more time, I'm going to sleep forever. But we have had this exercise, I think was a big deal. The other thing is, which really kind of surprised me, was that New Yorker article from just a few years ago.
Yeah, Catherine Schultz wrote an article in the New Yorker called "The Really Big One," and I think it really woke up a lot of people to the East Coast that we have a real earthquake problem here in the Pacific Northwest. And I think she did a good job of looking at some of the research that we talked about and how our understanding developed. But I think it was a little bit, it also led some people to think that a tsunami may cross the coastal range and flood us directly from the west coast in the urban areas here. A lot of people came away from the article with maybe a little exaggerated sense of how bad it's going to be. And that's dangerous in the sense that we're all likely to be here after that big earthquake. There may be some unfortunate casualties, but the vast majority of us are going to be in our homes and in our neighborhoods having to cope with the aftermath of this giant earthquake. What we do today, what we do tomorrow and this next week to prepare for that is going to be huge in how we experience that, how our children experience that, and how rapidly we can recover, and whether we have jobs when we put it back together again.
Well, that's the other point that often sort of gets overlooked, and that's really not the mission we're on now. But this is not our this is not our only bite at the apple. We plan to do more on this down, and we have been doing stuff on and off.
Yeah.
You know, we're over at your place multiple times when something happens every year, talking about getting ready. Yeah. But it does matter. And there was a guy, his name was Chuck Ruth. He was the bridge engineer for the state of Washington back in the 90s, and he started the push on retrofitting bridges. And if you got the time, you get results. So as I drive around the state, in fact, I will see bridges that I can see were retrofitted. There were things that he was talking about, you know, where you're talking about a bridge and it's being supported here, but if you start shaking it, the beams come out and they drop down. Now the bridge is not useful, not to mention somebody injured or killed as a result of it. A lot of those bridges have been fixed. You can see the repairs, the collaring with steel over the columns and everything else, and also just to keep even the simpler bridges from slipping off their foundations. A lot of that work's been done.
And it's expensive work. I mean, it's a big investment. So they've had to stagger it out over decades rather than doing it rapidly. And as you mentioned, doing the bridge decks and for some critical bridges, some of the column work, that's been done, but there's a lot that hasn't been done too, and some of these bridges are still sort of vulnerable, which is why the codes and the new bridges that WashDOT are building are really important too, so that as time goes on, we keep improving the building stock, because you can't bring a really old bridge up to current standards very easily. It's easier to build a new bridge.
Right, and we actually have a bridge we can see from our window here that's actually a test. It's been designed to resist an earthquake because it's flexible. It will bend. It has a metal alloy, a combination of several alloys and a flexible concrete that will snap back to its original position when it's done. So we'll see
so
how
it's a
that
balancing act. We can't do everything all at once, but we can make that steady progress, as you mentioned, and over time it makes a huge difference.
But I want to go, since this next question is very relevant to that, what about evacuation routes? Should we get out of the city?
Yeah, generally no. I mean, we listen to our emergency managers and FEMA and others that are kind of assisting in the response to the earthquake, but you're not going to be able to get right out of the city. I mean, the causeways, the bridges are going to be closed for inspection if nothing else. So you're not going to be able to get out of the city right away. So what we need to do is work in our neighborhoods to make sure everyone's safe and that we share the resources we have available to kind of ride through that first week or two of really rough recovery until the cavalry can arrive.
But one of the things that came out of the exercise was fuel.
Yeah.
That they're literally prepared. One of the things we look at, these giant bags will be filled with diesel, gasoline, whatever they want to do, in just miles of pipe, primarily so they can keep the first responders, the National Guard, and the folks who are trying to get to people going. But you may not have fuel. You may have what's in your car. The question is, how far can you get?
That's a big problem, and we're very dependent. We have 5 refineries to the north of us near Anacortes, and we have pipelines that are vulnerable, but and to move that fuel, and we have some storage here locally and elsewhere, but trying to get the distribution of that, I recommend that everyone keep their tanks at least half full. So if you get to half full in your tank, fill it up again. And then if the earthquake comes and you're not able to get fuel, you at least have half a tank.
Right. Quick, this is critical. This always comes up, and it's come up again. Nicole asked, should we stay inside or go outdoors if we feel shaking?
Stay inside. 99 and 44 100% of the time you stay inside, because most people get injured trying to leave a building and having things fall on them. That's the most common cause of injuries during an earthquake. And it's our instinct to flee. We want to run out to safety, and yet most often we're leaving the safest place to go into danger when we do that. In particular, here in downtown Seattle or in any big city where we have high rises, it can be really frightening to sway around in a high rise, but you are so much safer in that building than you are out on the street.
And don't go out and get on the elevator either.
That's right. Or where the glass is falling, down to litter the streets. I would, if I knew an earthquake, I had an earthquake early warning, a big earthquake was coming, and I was in a car in downtown Seattle, I would get out of that car and run into a tall building. I wouldn't try to get away from that building.
If you went there and you go, one of the things, if you are inside, get under a desk, get under a heavy piece of furniture, get your head.
Protect yourself, move away from the glass, get under something that anything falling down will hit the table before it hits you.
I think we're going to cover this tomorrow. Linda asked, be prepared with a fire extinguisher. What are other little known items to help prepare? A lot of that is right now on king5.com/disaster in terms of the guidebooks, things that are out there.
Great.
In terms of, you can just go down that list and see the things that you can get. Gary asks, could a big quake in one zone cause a ripple effect to other faults?
Yes, it can, and we've seen this happen. All hell broke loose around 1100 years ago in the Puget Sound area. We had a big earthquake on the Seattle Fault. We have evidence of land level changes that Brian Sherrod discovered with the USGS, a paleo-seismologist there, that really can't be explained, that occurred about 1100 years ago, that can't be explained by motion on the Seattle Fault in the leading edge here. So that earthquake may have triggered the other end, possibly the other end of the fault down by Tacoma, the Tacoma Fault, or some other structure that caused land level changes down there. And there were other things that happened within this window of 100 years or so that could have been coincidence with the Seattle Fault earthquake, as in the same day, or it may have been weeks or months later, but a whole lot of things clustered together in that period of time.
But that goes back to the continuing need to do the science.
That's right. We don't understand, we don't know whether there will be multiple earthquakes. There'll be some sympathetic faulting. We saw in Tohoku there were a number of magnitude 7 earthquakes that occurred outside of the subduction zone where the main thrust occurred. We call them sympathetic faulting. They're faults that are loaded with a lot of strain, and the shaking from the big earthquake leads them to break and cause other earthquakes. And they can be called aftershocks, but when they're on faults unrelated to the main fault that broke, we usually call them sympathetic faulting or related earthquakes.
Most asked, how far would a Puget Sound tsunami come inland?
No, not far. Not far. We've got pretty high, high hills.
If you're
here
at the low points down.
Right. The main thing is it's not safe to be on the water after a significant earthquake. You want to move up away from the water. And there's a number of reasons for it. There could have been a tsunami generated, and you won't get a warning for that. We don't have the means of alerting people for that, of discovering it and alerting it in a timely way for an earthquake in the Sound. Secondly, it could be submarine landsliding. There could be a big landslide break loose an hour after the earthquake that falls into deep water and generates a local tsunami that can really flood out low-lying areas. That happened in the 1949 earthquake at Salmon Beach down near Tacoma. A week out, crack formed during the earthquake, and about a few days later, almost a week later, it broke loose with a big landslide. It generated a tsunami that went over to Gig Harbor, bounced back, and flooded the houses that the landslide had missed near Salmon Beach. So it happens.
It happens.
Yeah.
We've kind of covered this already, but in terms of local bridges ready for a big earthquake, I think a lot of them are, but you said, as you were pointing out, some of them aren't. And we fixed part of this problem. One of the most vulnerable structures was the 520 bridge.
Right.
Now we are fixing the last part of that. So we have the new 520 that's there because of the earthquake threat.
It's also the approaches to it, too.
And the approaches, now the western approach going by your neck of the woods at the UW, that's getting closer.
Yeah.
That's the next piece that's sort of out there. All right.
And it's a mixed bag. So if we have some sturdier bridges and other weaker, and they have somewhat different natural frequencies, the hope is that some of them will survive, and some of them may be closed for repairs or be damaged, but that will still be able to restore some kind of connectivity fairly rapidly.
Well, the bottom line here is that all this stuff takes time. The question is, how much time do we have? And as we've gone over the last 20 years, a lot of those bridges that we were talking about earlier, that was one bridge in, 94, 95, is now a lot of bridges. It's not all the bridges, but they're trying to get to that, and there's simpler fixes on some than that there are on others. Well, I think we're actually pretty much out of time here. It's about 8:30, so I'm going to wrap it up. Bill, thanks again. We're going to, again, tomorrow is our big day. So all day, all screens, all platforms, disaster. The idea here is to give you as much information to get you prepared, because all of this is survivable, and you're going to see people who are ready to survive this, examples where people did survive this in Japan, buildings that stood up through very large earthquakes, and what can happen when you're not ready.
Great, thank you.
All right.
We're clear.